Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman from Claremont Graduate University. You know, a lot of churches are losing members, and I asked Dr. Bowman, why is that? So we'll talk about factors that could be, why are people turning to alternative religions? Also, what role does politics play in religious disaffection? So, should churches double down or liberalize in order to gain members? You won't want to miss this conversation with Dr. Bowman. Check it out. This gets into something else we talked about last week that I'd like to dive into, because institutional religion, maybe I'll say it that way, is losing influence. And one of the things that you said was, I will term fundamentalist religion, where they ask you to do hard things. They ask you not to drink. They ask you to pay tithing. They ask you to go to church and to Relief Society and Sunday school and everything. And I'm putting that in an LDS context, but it applies to evangelicalism as well. Pentecostals don't drink. Muslims don't drink. And it's when a religion becomes less strict, it seems to lose adherents, but when it becomes more strict, it demands more of its members. That can be really attractive too. Can you talk about that? Yeah. Is that something? I mean, the LDS Church is wrestling with this right now, right? Mm-hmm. And not just the LDS Church, Catholicism, Protestantism, like everybody's dealing with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really interesting, right? And it's also a deeply American question. Because, right, as I said earlier, the way American religious life is structured, we kind of take it for granted in the U.S. that this is how religion works, right? That there's different churches, different denominations, different institutions of religion that compete for members, and you get to pick the one you want to go to, right? That's actually, historically speaking, a very kind of bizarre way to do religion in American culture or in global culture, right? Historically, this has never been the norm, but it's something that the U.S. created with deinstitutionalization. The disestablishment of religion with the First Amendment and the gradual application of the First Amendment to the states, right? We created what some scholars call a religious marketplace. So the idea here is, and it's something that comes from an article, a really famous article by a sociologist of religion named Lawrence Iacone called Why Strict Churches Are Strong. And he observed, right, that many of churches with what he called high tension with the society around them in the United States, that is, churches that asked their members to act in ways contrary to broader American cultural norms, tended to be retaining membership and even growing. And he was talking here about some of these conservative evangelical churches, but also about the LDS Church. Whereas religions with low cultural tension, religions that did not ask their members to do anything counter to broader American norms, tended to be losing members.
When was this written?
The 70s, and he's looking at the 70s, 80s,
okay.
90s, particularly.
So we've caught up with
and that's what many sociologists have observed, right? Is that and this is why there's some pushback against his idea, right? Is that this idea seemed to be true in the waning decades of the 20th century. Now it appears that some of that trend, right, that trend of losing membership, which is really, really afflicting especially mainline Protestant churches. That is to say, these more kind of liberal Protestant churches that accommodated themselves to American culture. That is, the ones that largely abandoned Sabbatarianism, right? The idea that you do not engage in economic commerce on the Sabbath. Mainline Protestant churches abandoned that a long time ago. Mainline churches that were advocates for temperance, like not drinking alcohol, gave that up as well. That these churches were just hemorrhaging members in the late 20th century. Whereas churches that held to Sabbatarianism, that held to temperance, that held to strict sexual norms, whereas many mainline churches were abandoning strict sexual norms after the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Churches that held to those things were retaining members and even growing. So Iacono thought this was very interesting. And his theory, the theory that he offered as to why this was happening, was that kind of high demand brought with it rewards as well. And we might have a conversation about what those rewards are. One was a sort of strong sense of community, right? That these strict churches maintained a really strong social network. The sort of social network, right, that meant that members took care of each other. That there was a safety net essentially for economic catastrophe. The members of the churches would care for each other. They had friends. They had a community. They had companions. Whereas, he noted, right, these mainline churches, as they became less and less high demand of their members' time as much as anything else, that kind of community dissipated somewhat. That may be one reward. Another reward would be what other sociologists of religion, I'm thinking here of Stark and Bainbridge particularly, called supernatural compensators. That is, those strict churches were also the churches that held to talking about things like faith healing, prophecy, right? These kinds of ideas that God could touch your lives in a way that mainline churches were less and less talking about.
Miracles, that kind of thing.
Miracles, right, precisely, right? And so now there's a lot of questions about this thesis. One is, like, does this apply outside the United States? I think it's such a common thing for people in the United States to sort of assume that their ways of thinking about religion are universal, whereas religion functions in very, very different ways in Europe, in Latin America, in India, right? And is this kind of idea mappable onto, say, Indian society or Egyptian society, where that marketplace of religion idea, that notion, right, that there's a lot of denominations that compete for members, doesn't really exist in the same way in many other societies around the world.
Especially Arab countries, if you're a Christian and if you're doing any sort of missionary work, you're going to jail.
Yeah, right. And even like a church like, say, like England, right, where there actually is an established church. There's a church that the government supports. With tax dollars. Yeah.
The Anglican Church is supported by the government?
King Charles is the head of the Anglican Church, right? And Germany, actually, in the same way in Germany, there are established churches in Germany as well. And I notice, right, your kind of astonishment at that, I think, demonstrates, right, how kind of
I knew that was the case before, but I was like, still?
Yeah, it absolutely still is the case.
Wow.
Right? So religion functions in very different ways in other communities. And this kind of phenomenon, then, might not kind of map onto other, to non-American societies in the same way. Another issue with that thesis is what we mentioned a moment ago, which is that it appears that for many of these strict churches, this trend of membership is beginning to catch up with even stricter churches as well. That this kind of disaffiliation from institutional religion is increasingly happening within those stricter churches.
But instead of going to atheism, they're just going to astrology and tarot cards and things like that, right?
Yeah. And I want to say, right, that is true kind of nationwide, right, is that the majority of the nuns are still interested in very spiritual
but
practices.
Not religious.
Yes, exactly. And that's such an interesting phrase, right? People who say that phrase, what they're thinking in their brains is that religion is something institutions do. Spiritual is something that individuals do. And their kind of redefinition of those terms, I think, is really fascinating. Because you will find, there are many people, I think, especially outside the U.S., for whom those terms are synonymous. Right, they mean the same thing. But in the U.S., we have spiritual means individual, religious means institutional.
Mm-hmm.
There are more people in the U.S. who say I am religious and spiritual than see it as a dichotomy in that way. But that spiritual but not religious group is a growing minority.
Right. Well, and so I know I'm putting you in the case to counsel religious leaders here, but I'm going to put you there anyway. What can religious leaders, LDS, Protestant, Evangelical, Catholic, whatever, do to not only to create more high demand, if that's what it takes, but it also seems like politics, especially here in the United States, I don't know about Europe and other places, but that's what has really forced a lot of people to say, I don't want to be Catholic. I don't want to be Mormon. I support abortion rights, gay rights, things like that. And so it's kind of the infusion of religion and politics that is forcing a lot of people away from the nuns, or into the nuns, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one caveat, though, before we start, right? I think religion and politics in the United States have always been deeply intertwined. There's really no way to separate them. So I don't know that, saying that the church should not mix with state, right? Religion should stay out of politics. I think that's just a fundamental impossibility, right? The Ten Commandments bars murder. So does that mean we should not make laws against murder because the religion teaches it? But I think what people often mean is, when we say that, is exactly what you're saying, which is to say the extent to which a certain faction of Christians in the United States have come to identify traditional sexual teachings as being fundamental to what it is to be religious. All right, I think that's, to be kind of precise, that is what has happened, is that a number of Christians in the U.S. have come to really identify the word Christian with more or less Victorian sexual norms, and have kind of linked the idea of Christianity and Victorian sexual norms so closely that, ironically, many people on the left have actually bought into that. Right? Many people on the left have said, yeah, I guess being Christian means that I'm against same-sex marriage, that I'm against abortion, so I'm not going to be Christian anymore, right? Which I think is kind of ironic, because I think these people have already accepted what sexually conservative Christians have told them is right, and said, yes, you're right, so I'm just going to walk away, rather than say, are there other ways of imagining what Christianity is? Yeah. Is this link that you've made actually real? It is undeniably true. I think there's a great amount of statistical data on this, and I would recommend the work of David Campbell on this, an LDS sociologist at Notre Dame. His book American Grace, I think, dives into the ways in which young people, especially young people who are identifying increasingly as nuns, cite issues of sexuality.
Well, and it's also interesting to me because I'm going to talk about the Christian Coalition, the religious right. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're highly, and even the LDS Church has kind of integrated itself with evangelicalism and evangelical politics. But when you look at Jewish religion, some Jesuit scholars, a little bit more accepting of abortion, of gay marriage, that sort of a thing. They don't have the same megaphone as the Jerry Falwells and people like that are just as religious. But when people think, oh, I'm religious, therefore I'm against gay marriage, I'm against abortion rights, I'm against all this, and so they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they don't go to these liberal Jews, Catholics, even Mormons. I mean, the leadership in the LDS Church seems more accepting of right-wing conservative Jews than left-wing liberal views. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think, I kind of recoil at the idea of saying grouping religions on the left-right axis, right? Because what that does is that states that the left-right axis, that's our fundamental.
But that's what a lot of people are reacting to, aren't they?
I think that's what many people think, right? And I wish it weren't that way.
Yeah.
I think, though, you're absolutely correct to say one of the great successes of the religious right in America is its kind of public relations, right? Its ability to kind of set up and say, this is Christianity. Christianity means you are against same-sex marriage. If you're not Christian, or if you're not against same-sex marriage, you're not a Christian.
Is that coming back to bite them in the butt now? Because people are I got to leave my church because I disagree with that.
I think that's exactly right? I think it has contributed, right, to this exodus of young people and this tendency on the part of young people to hear religion or hear the word Christian and simply say that means anti-homosexuality, right? And not, I think, kind of look at the many other resources that historic Christianity has within it to do and offer other things. So you said a moment ago, right? What would I mean, if I, who am I to counsel the leaders of American religions, and particularly the leaders of my own church?
You'll get a call from your stake president,
right? I'm just a dude, right? I'm nobody here. And it's a tough question, right? Because in one sense, it is what we're talking about here are really macro, large-scale cultural trends that I don't know that are not the cause of any one group of people sitting around a table and saying, we're going to do this now, and now the whole culture, culture doesn't work like that, right? If 25 people agree to do something, even if they're the leaders of religions, it's really, really hard to push cultural trends in one way or another. I think one valuable thing, though, is to make well-informed decisions. And one of those well-informed decisions, one thing I think that is valuable to know is what we've been talking about here, which is to say that all the surveys show that the nones, the spiritual but not religious people, the people who say they're no religion in particular, they're not atheists. They're not simply saying, oh, religion is dumb and I don't want any part of it. Many of them hunger for the sorts of things that religion does. They are interested in this kind of large-scale meaning-making, a mechanism for exploiting the cosmos, for the purpose of human existence, for ordering your universe, right? And that, if you think about it, that's what things like astrology and tarot and all of these other practices that are just taking off on TikTok and Instagram and that are attracting so many young people. There's one survey that I've seen by a group called the Springtide Institute, which studies young people in religion. And I read recently that in their work that 70% of LDS members under the age of 29 say they're familiar with the tarot. 70%.
Wow.
Yeah, which I think shows, right, how rapidly these sorts of things are spreading. What these things are, isn't
that just the new Ouija board from the 80s?
Yeah, right. And that's great. That's a great analogy, right? Because all of these things are tools. They are religious tools for trying to access spiritual power, spiritual knowledge, the sense that the universe is fundamentally not kind of blind, chaotic atoms bumping into each other, that there is meaning here, right? And young people want that. Everybody wants that meaning. The tools by which we seek that meaning, that's the real question. And why is it the young people are flocking to tarot and to energy work and to this sort of stuff, right? It's because the way that they are encountering it is consonant with how they understand what the society they want to live in is like. That is to say, fundamentally kind of driven individually, driven by their peers, their friends, the people they're seeing on social media, and it doesn't have associations for them that institutional religion increasingly does, which is to say kind of the success of the religious right. And that's why they're going in that direction. Right now, moving this stuff around, as I said before, right, this is not the work that, any kind of group of 25 or 30 people is going to be able to do, even if those people are in charge of major institutions. But it is to say, I would hope that the leaders of these major institutions might be aware of this and not simply kind of say, sacrament meeting is dropping. The people who aren't coming to sacrament meeting must be atheists and must be against religion now, because I don't think they are. Right, I think they're still hungry for that sort of stuff. They're seekers.
It leads to the question then, and once again it goes: do they go softer or do they go harder? And I'll just put it in the LDS Church, since this is an LDS podcast. Does the LDS Church become less strident about abortion rights, gay marriage, that sort of a thing, in order to attract these people back in? Or do they become more fundamentalist and, we crack down at BYU against intellectuals? Boyd K. Packer famously had that talk, it was in 1993, about the biggest threats to the church are feminist, intellectuals, and gays. Do they become more fundamentalist, or do they become more accepting in order to grow? Do you have an answer for that?
That's a tough one. It's a really tough one because, and I think sort of premise there, right, of that question is that there's two spectrums, right, and that, well, put it this way, right, say that the church embraces the sexual revolution, which is not something I think will happen, and for good reasons, but say that it did. The Unitarians did that.
The Community of Christ did that.
Yeah, are they growing?
No.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They're suffering the same problems we are.
Yeah, and so this is to say, right, I think that this is not simply... now the Community of Christ, for instance, they are attracting a lot of, I think, disaffected LDS folk, right, who are interested in the kind of culture war issues, and so there's that impetus.
But their real growth is in places like Africa, where they're against gay rights and things like that.
And I think, right, and have this sort of high sense, this really high sense of supernatural power and supernatural
patriarchy.
efficacy. And, well, which is to say, right, I think Americans, now this is what I said a moment ago, right, that I'm uncomfortable kind of saying left-right axis, and you have to pick somewhere on the left-right axis.
I'm sorry, I keep forcing you into it.
And if you pick, like, the left and liberals and stuff like that, then you're going to attract liberal people. But I think one of the things that's happening with religion worldwide is not on that axis at all, right? It's about what I said a moment ago, which is to say, right, spiritual hungers and the desire for power and ordering universes. How do we get access to that? Where do we find meaning? What gives us, the theologian Paul Tillich said, religion is ultimately about ultimate meanings, fundamental modes of organizing our universes. And certainly, right, I think issues of sexuality and so on, they're there, but they're kind of downstream from that basic idea of, what fundamentally gives you meaning in life? How do you understand what the meaning of your existence is? How do you gain power to heal and solve your problems, right? Where do you turn for that sort of thing? And what's interesting is, right, and I think you used the word fundamentalist a moment ago, which is another term we could dissect, I think. Mm-hmm. But in the U.S., at least, groups that tend to hold very strictly to, and we said this a moment ago, right, to issues of doctrine.
Biblical literalism.
Mm-hmm. These are also the groups that talk the most about miracles. Mm-hmm. And that talk about kind of that supernatural power and supernatural efficacy. The question, I think, is, and it's an interesting one, is that, if many of these, and especially, right, you will see, I think, many feminist-leaning and queer young people in the church are flocking to things like paganism and Wicca, magic.
Because it's miracles.
What's the difference between that and priesthood blessings? It's filling the same kind of hungers, right? So I think, right, what we're seeing here is young people still want this stuff, right? They're looking. I mean, and I don't mean for this to sound kind of insolent when I say, right, what's the difference between Wiccan magic and priesthood blessings? I mean, obviously, right, to believers, there's a vast difference there. But as a sociologist of religion, which I am not, but if I were a sociologist of religion, I would say, right, what we're seeing here is people looking for the same sorts of things. The difference between a patriarchal blessing and astrology. Now, again, right, there's a vast difference there, perhaps, but fundamentally, right, these are ways in which people look for direction and look for explanatory mechanisms and look for ordering of their universes. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different vectors here that are intersecting at the same time. All this is to say, right, I don't think it's quite as easy as saying, like, do they move left on abortion and then people are going to come to church again, right? There's a lot of factors here and a lot of cultural trends, and politics is one of them. But I think absolutely right, consumerism in America is another. Consumerism, capitalism has taught us. I used this metaphor earlier, right? A metaphor of the marketplace of religion. Right, that's a metaphor. And that's saying we think about religion the same way we think about shopping for breakfast cereals. You pick the one you like the best. And the fact that we do that in America, right, we say, well, it's a question of, like, which church fits my tastes. We've been trained to think about that. And all of the churches in the United States have to kind of grapple with the fact that they live in a society in which we think that way. This is why churches worry about websites and put up billboards, right? If you think about it, right, in a kind of like deep level, it's bizarre that religions do that. But they do it because they've been taught and disciplined by capitalism to think of themselves as existing in a marketplace and having to appeal to people. We see this, I think, in the missionary program of the LDS Church, right? Missionaries are taught sales techniques. They function like explicitly, right? Alvin Dyer, the great kind of mission leader of the mid-20th century, was a salesman, and he explicitly spoke about mission work as a sales job because he had been kind of disciplined in capitalism in that way. So just as with kind of the politics issue and the issue of kind of gender and all of that, it's not as easy as just saying, right, well, do something different. It's about kind of digging into this deeply and thinking, why is it that we assume that religion has to work in this way? It's because we live in a society that's already been disciplined into a left-right political axis. We live in a society that's already been disciplined in capitalist and consumerist ways. And I wonder if it would be valuable for leaders of these organizations to realize that and to think, right? Not simply kind of think, where are we going to stand on this spectrum? But to think, why is it we're standing on the spectrum in the first place? How can I talk about my religion in such a way that kind of makes us all aware that this is a spectrum that exists, and instead of just having the same fights over and over and over again, maybe we should think about how we can try to transcend the spectrum.
Well, this whole idea about miracles, I think, is really fascinating because I look at the Denver Snuffer followers. Those are the people who are seeking the spiritual gifts the most. And, Julie Rowe, Chad Debo, I mean, I don't want to put them on the same plane, but once again, they're seeking these spiritual gifts. And I look at, Pentecostalism, speaking in tongues, that can be really popular, but it still seems, and I attended a Bicker Tonight service in Florida in January with Steve Pineacre. The theme of, and I don't know what they call their service, but it sure felt like sacrament meeting to me. The theme of sacrament meeting was miracles, and they all got up and talked about the miracles in their life and miracle healings and everything. And, Patrick McKay, he's an apostle in a restoration group, and he has a book, Healing the Breach. The whole book is about miracles. And so I can understand how that is attractive to a lot of people. It's attractive to me, for heaven's sake. But, and maybe I keep asking this question, and maybe you're just telling me you don't really have an answer, and that's fine. But do you see if the LDS Church, Catholic Church, emphasize these miracles, would that bring more people back to the pews?
Maybe, right? Well, and here's the thing, right? Again, I think we have to think in a global perspective. There's a lot of miracles happening in the LDS Church in Africa.
Oh, absolutely.
There's healings, there's visions, there's prophecy, all sorts of stuff like that, right? I think the interesting question here is, again, about kind of the evolution of American culture and the emergence of science as a way of thinking and a way of talking, which makes miracles increasingly implausible. There's, and that's one factor here, right? There's a lot of people in the United States.
Do we need more 3 Nephite stories?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who will say, like, that's silly, right? And Joseph Smith seeing angels, he's a con man, right?
Cain on the road.
He's a con man. People will say Joseph Smith was a con man because those things don't happen. People don't see angels. Another factor in this, right, is ideas about respectability. It is likely true that the LDS Church began downplaying and discouraging speaking in tongues in the early 20th century because by that point it had become deeply associated with Pentecostalism. And Pentecostalism...
We were the ones that started it.
Pentecostalism was seen as very lower class, very uneducated. The early Pentecostalism was quite racially inclusive. They had female preachers. All of these things which were perceived by middle-class, upper-class white Americans as disrespectable. And this is a time when the LDS Church is very much seeking respectability.
See, they were never classified as a so-called cult, though. Because they worship the right Jesus, even though they were just
there are some that are. Oneness Pentecostalism denies the Trinity, and many evangelicals really do not like them. Pentecostals and evangelicals have a very troubled history. But this is to say, right, that the reasons why miracles, tongue-speaking, glossolalia, as it's called, all of these things begin to fade in the LDS Church, at least publicly in the LDS Church. That is not a part of public worship, not something publicly discussed, I think has a lot to do with the rise of the authority of science in American culture and respectability politics, to use an academic phrase, which is to say people want to do things that they think people higher up the social ladder will like and respect. So the LDS Church, right, adopts respectability in the mid-20th century. And it's the respectability of the white American middle and upper class that they adopt. That does not include speaking in tongues. That does not include faith healing in sacrament services, right? All this sort of stuff. So that stuff falls out of American LDS culture. But, as I say, it's still very much a part of LDS culture in the global South, because the same kind of respectability politics aren't at work down there as they are in the global North.
Fascinating. Well, I'll give you one last thing here. What advice can you give to religious leaders to get more butts in the seats?
Oh, you're asking me that again? As I say, right, I think I would encourage them to think broadly about the processes that are happening to American institutional religion in the 20th century, to avoid simplistic answers, to avoid saying, right, that people are leaving the church because of thing X or thing Y or thing Z. It's lots of things. And to understand, in a sense, that this is a broad, multivalent cultural trend that I frankly don't know that any single religious institution has it within itself to reverse. Because it's not happening within a single religious institution. It's happening to all religious institutions. And so we have to think really deeply about how American culture functions, how American societies function, and make decisions based on that.
All right. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Bowman from Claremont Graduate University. Our next conversation with him is going to be our last, so please sign up to our free newsletter at gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and I'll send you a secret link. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about academic freedom at BYU.
Right, Jesuit philosophy education is really deep and really expansive and really thoughtful. And there are I'm speaking as someone who was educated at a Jesuit university,
Georgetown.
Yes, there were Jesuit ideas about education, about economics, about history, about philosophy, about all of these things. I would love to see what would an LDS economic theory look like. I don't think we really know.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe on either Patreon or at gospeltangents.com. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire audio uninterrupted. On our $10 tier, if you would like to see the whole video, you can see that either on youtube.com/gospeltangents, or I've got a special Facebook group devoted for full videos. So subscribe at gospeltangents.com and sign up for just $10 a month. For $20 a month, if you'd like to get some bonus content, maybe some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor, you can sign up for that. And then if you'd like to talk to me for $100 a month, we'll do a monthly phone call on something like Zoom, and you can ask me anything you want. So thanks again. Also, don't forget about the merch, mugs, T-shirts, hats, things like that. I'm trying to get the ties up there. Hopefully I can get up there. And thanks again for watching Gospel Tangents, and click here for some more videos.